Thank you for coming out and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I am Steve McDonald. I am a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center and the former director of the Africa program. I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of Jane Harmon, the president and CEO, and Dr. Monde Moyangwa, who is the current director of the Africa program. Ironically, she can't be with us today because she's in South Africa. So there you go. You all came here. She went there. So welcome. Most of you know the Woodrow Wilson Center. I won't spend a lot of time explaining who we are. It's an organization founded in 1968 by an act of Congress to try to fulfill the Wilsonian ideal of bringing together the worlds of policy and the worlds of academia, world of practitioners, to better understand each other and better inform policymakers. And so that's what we do here in the Africa program. Of course, we concentrate on a lot of the burning issues of Africa and followed South Africa very closely. I am particularly honored and happy to welcome you here. This is the third time I've had the opportunity to do so. Your fellow students from tranches past. And I do so because I've got a long-standing interest in South Africa itself. I was first there in 1976, long before most of you were born, as a diplomat during some really tough times. But also some years later, I ran an organization called the U.S. South Africa Leader Development Program, which had a very similar objective to what SAWIP does. It was a program that was closed after 1994. Funding was difficult to come by then when the changes came, and it never redefined its mission quite well enough to attract donors. But it had done some remarkable work with young lawyers and media journalists and other professionals and others, working primarily with the black community, but the intent was the same. So I'm actually very happy to be aware of the creation of SAWIP in 2007 and the work they're doing, because it picks up that cudgel that was dropped by USALEP, and of course you are developing into very valuable leaders for your country and I hope for the continent. But anyway, so I want to welcome you just with these few words. I'll be on the panels later with you, so I don't want to stay here too long. Let me introduce Karen Stratum, who is going to welcome you on behalf of SAWIP.
Thank you, Steve. Well, this is your second welcome, and you'll get a third welcome, and then the program will start. So you should all feel very welcome. Now, first of all, yes, on behalf of SAWIP's board, Karen Stratum, Vice Chair of the SAWIP board here at US, we welcome each and every one of you, and I have a special shout out, I don't see him yet, but to Ambassador Don Gibbs, who is actually a chair of our advisory council. And now I get to the thanks. I absolutely want to thank Steve and the Wilson Center because they've been terrific partners. This is the third year that we host this wonderful event in the afternoon and in the evening. We also want to thank the embassy. So these two partners, very good. They've worked with us, and they also help us put this all together. I also want to thank all our wonderful panelists and moderators. Now, we have a really, really great setup this afternoon. It's very exciting. I'm personally very excited to learn more about what's coming out of it. One of the panels is also constituted of some of our young student leaders, so that's going to be really exciting. I also want to thank all of you for coming out, because you could have done something else on this very beautiful summer day here in DC. And I want to really, and maybe I don't even need to do that, but I want to encourage you to please participate, because we're all here to learn from one another. So thank you and welcome. So I'm not going to say very much more, but it's a conspicuous year and a very important year, because yes, we are celebrating 20 years of freedom and democracy in South Africa. But there is a lot that remains to be done. But from SAWIP's perspective, when we look at this cohort here and we see some of our other alumni, and we know there's so many others back in South Africa who hold dear to Madiba's values, who actually have the passion and the energy and were willing to actually get their hands dirty to make things work. We are truly inspired by this group. And we hope by the end of today, in the evening, you will be too. And we think that South Africa is in the very best hands possible. So we are excited to have all of you here. Thank you again. And before we actually have our third welcome, which I think is Alu. Alu, are you here yet from the embassy? Which is actually a good thing because we have a video to show you. So if you can sit back, this is a commercial break, and watch a short video about SOUP. Thank you.
This network of South Africans is set to, I think, affect great change in South Africa, and I think people should want to be a part of that.
And seeing life here, seeing American politics, and speaking to inspirational people about entrepreneurship and civil rights and human rights and dignity, the world has been open to me that I never knew existed.
Almost 2 decades after the end of apartheid, South Africa still faces daunting challenges, including the significant gaps in social and economic equity that continue to exist. The need for a new generation of leaders to bridge these gaps in South Africa is great. The South Africa-Washington International Program is helping to inspire, develop and support this new generation of diverse young leaders who are service-oriented, socially conscious and globally aware to address these challenges in South Africa and beyond. SOUP selects a diverse group of outstanding South African university students each year to participate in a 6-month program of intensive leadership skill building and cross-cultural immersion. As a part of their training, students spend 6 weeks in Washington, D.C. and New York City, living with host families and gaining a deeper understanding of global leadership challenges by working alongside and being mentored by political, business, civic and non-profit leaders. Our unique program promotes interaction among and between student leaders from South Africa and emerging young leaders from around the world. In the process, historical divisions are overcome, values are shared, and the roots of democratic political ideals are more firmly established. SOUP's exceptional young leaders are already making their mark in South Africa. Our growing network of alumni includes a diverse and highly skilled group of engineers, attorneys, social entrepreneurs, business, civic, and non-profit professionals. Join us to help these emerging leaders who, in a few years' time, will be at the forefront of building a better South Africa and making positive contributions globally.
You cannot, I don't think, sincerely come into this program and leave the same person that you started out as. It's life-changing stuff.
One of the things I've learned is just how it feels to be on the inside. So in South Africa and in Africa often, we feel like we're on the outside trying to break in. And here we're in structures of global governance which affect change on the world from the inside. And so I think once you understand those structures from the inside and you're not sort of standing back from this tall building looking up on it as it sort of like reaches into the clouds, you're actually sitting in the top floor, so to speak. You get a deep insight into, when you go back into your country, how you can form symbiotic relationships with South Africa, Africa, and the centers of power on the inside.
Every single day, I'm just like, thank you, Lord, that I'm here, because it's really an amazing program, and love every moment of it.
The discussions that we've had have been invaluable. The people that we've met have imparted immense depth of wisdom and knowledge onto all of us. However, the most important thing that I've got out of this experience is speaking to my fellow team members about issues that we all feel passionate about in South Africa. The passion that I see in myself, I see in them. The passion I see for future South Africa, they share with me. The passions that we have for equality, they share. And that is by far the most beautiful thing.
Your first panel, maybe, and then Alu can greet us on behalf of the embassy when he arrives.
We can do that. It'll take us a few minutes to set up the next panel, so I'm not sure they've all arrived yet either. So let me see where we stand on that. I still don't have a staff member in there.
In the meantime, if anyone has any questions about SOA, I'm sure one of our wonderful students here will be able to answer. Yes. Who funds it? Who funds it? That's a really important question. We are glad you asked that question. We are privately funded. We are funded on two sides of the ocean. This is a 6-month leadership curriculum. Lots of it takes place in South Africa, and then we have 5 to 6 weeks here in DC and in New York City. On both sides of the ocean, it's essentially funded by private individuals, foundations, and companies. Yes.
Tell us a bit about the curriculum.
Okay, the curriculum. So I wonder, is Jay or anybody here? I can quickly jump in. What we typically do, and one of the South African students can tell you about what happens in South Africa. There's a lot of preparation around leadership development. A big part of this whole program is community development. And I'm not talking community development. Each of these guys are community leaders. Some of them have their own NGOs. They're all involved with community development. But one of the key parts is really to develop them and to support them as they go back and actually do a much larger community development project. When they come here, actually there are various components which are very exciting. The first one is a sort of a cultural exchange. They stay with American host families. And I can't tell you how very, very thankful we all are, because the host families open their houses and homes for 6 weeks to these guys, these hooligans from South Africa. But I hear they get so much out of it, and about more than 90% of our host families want to return. So they have that. They spend some time in work placement. So we don't want to call it internships because it's very short-lived, but these guys actually spend time in places like the World Bank, on the Hill, in NGOs, in private sector businesses, where they actually get exposed to a professional and also a leadership environment over here. And then they have their leadership development curriculum too. Each of the weeks are actually dedicated to a theme, like civil rights or business and environment or policy and so on. And then they go and they meet also with business leaders, with people on the Hill and others who come and talk to them. One of the other exciting aspects is there are actually sort of 3, we can call it sister organizations. The one is WIP, it's the Washington International Program. It's 20 years old this year, and actually SOWIP is an offshoot of that. And WIP is an 8-week-long program. They bring 50 students from Northern Ireland here, and more or less the same time. So the South African students, the WIP students, and also NSL students, that's a much newer program. They bring Israeli and Palestinian students together. So there's also a lot of sharing among these student groups. And also these guys go out and they meet and they network and they impress people, because people who meet them, I hope each of you have a chance to talk to at least some of them, come away universally impressed and, as I said earlier, inspired about what this means for the future of South Africa and also for Africa. Where do we stand with the panel, Steve?
Well, we're waiting for them to arrive.
So
we still have to do a little wean.
Okay. So I wonder, Steve, do you think the students can lead us with something?
Well, if we have more questions, let's go with them, yeah.
Please go ahead. Yeah. Sorry? How are the students selected? That's also a very good question. There is a very competitive process back in South Africa. It gets advertised at the campuses where we recruit from. At this point in time, we actually have 4 campuses, 3 in the Western Cape, the University of Stellenbosch, University of Cape Town, University
ahead and sit down here, Gwen, until I call you up.
There is a very large application tool, and they go through rigorous selection.
What we're doing, we need someone on a mic too.
And then they actually go through further selection, so that in the end we end up with about 15 students from the Western Cape, and this year we've introduced 4 students from the University of Pretoria.
If I may, Karen, everything that's being said is not being picked up by the recording because you're not using microphones. I'm not just being egotistical to stand up here at the dais to use a microphone. So we do have one here. And if I can get a staff member tomorrow or someone, excuse me, one of my staff members, let's use a microphone. We're doing a question and answers. Yeah. So now, the next hand, well, the one next to you there, that's convenient. And then we'll have one down front here and one over there.
Thank you very much. I noticed a pretty good cross-section.
Sorry,
No, I'm sorry.
Madam, there's somebody still
Someone
answering a question at the back. We'll get. Can I answer you next? Thank
Okay,
you.
yes. I'm Ed Barber from Good Works International, a consultancy founded by Andy Young. I noticed a pretty good cross-section in those pictures in terms of race. And you've just explained the sources of most of these applicants. I was wondering to what extent you're able to reach into some of the less advantaged parts of the population, schools that might not ordinarily have been thought of as candidates for this, and draw some of those students in.
So this is a very important question because to fully prepare South Africa, we need to really grasp across the diversity of South Africa. We are a young and growing non-for-profit. So what we do, we want to build a really strong program and then build from there. I think from about 2007, we have a really decent program that we have a fairly sized cohort. We started with the Western Cape. What happens in South Africa is also here in the United States. You actually have a lot of students from all over South Africa who actually want to go and study at those universities, and there are various mechanisms through which people who may have been otherwise very disadvantaged actually can get access. But that's not enough. We are trying to then go into the Gauteng area too for a little bit of a different diversity. We now with the University of Pretoria. We want to expand further there too to the University of Wits and also Johannesburg. There are many other universities that we also want to involve. And so it's a case to build a strong program, to have sufficient funding, and through our existing cohort, we actually reach quite deeply into some prior disadvantaged communities, but we also want to increase the pool from where we would also recruit people. So maybe what I can suggest is there are fantastic stories here just in this room that these guys can tell you in the coffee break and so on, where they actually come from, what their personal stories are, because that I'm sure would also inspire you. We had a great question here about Yali. To what? Can you repeat your question?
Wait
Madam?
for the microphone, Glory. Here it is.
Are you part of Yali? Is your group part of Yali, the young people who are here or who are coming?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. So you may have heard about the President's Initiative to bring the young leaders here, the Young African Leaders Initiative. We are in very close contact with the people who arranged that, with the USAID, with State Department. The Yali expectations are actually a little bit in terms of age group, just an age group higher than ours. It's 25 plus, people who are already established in professional, academic, etc. environments. We recruit between the ages of 19 and 25. So what we, at the very least, we know that our alumni pool is a really strong pool to draw from Yali. I think at least I have 1 or 2 alumni who are part of the Yali program this year. And as this is also the first year that Yali will bring its students into the US, the 500 strong, and also bring them to the White House for the summit, we'll be in contact and we'll try to learn more and see how we can establish more partnerships. Anybody else?
We'd seen 2 hands over here, yes.
There you go. I think, there you go.
Matthew, can you? Yeah. Okay. She's a former staffer. She can run down and get that mic. It should have been on.
Hello? It's on. Hi, my name is Sheila Sengupta. I work for the National Conference of State Legislatures. When you mentioned communities with a big C, is that a national community, a South African community, or do they also focus on the provincial level as well?
I think when I meant sort of a small c is that we see South Africa as a big community at various layers of community, and we want to prepare South African citizens broadly. We can serve the whole of South Africa very well. But I think for each of us to make a difference, it starts where we are, in our small community, our street, our school. But these guys also take it further to where they've come from. They've also established their own communities. And when they go back, we try to actually get them together in a larger community of community development. Typically, for now, that larger community development project is around the Western Cape. It will probably, maybe there's something around Pretoria. But the intent is to foster an idea of service leadership, that people serve their leaders, but they serve where they are, and they serve also the broader South Africa where they have the opportunity. So, how do we look on the panel there, Steve?
We're still a little short. Oh, here we come. Here comes Jennifer. But I wanted to ask one question.
Yes,
you may have said it, and I might have missed it, but do you work with professional placement and job placement in the ongoing years after the students have been here for their internship?
Well, I'm going to ask Jaya Jaya, there was a question from Steve. Do we work with professional placement when our students go back to South Africa as they're part of our alumni group?
Wait for a mic, Jaya.
Oh, do you want to come and stand here, Jaya?
It's
Jaya,
okay.
our executive director, who's put a lot of effort into this.
I'm sorry, what was the question, Steve?
After their internship, do you do any job placement, professional placement, mentoring?
Absolutely. So the 6-month leadership training program that happens, it's only a start of it. And part of the SAWIP journeys, we work with our students and alumni. We connect them with mentors. We provide them various opportunities to remain engaged in the program through workshops, through dialogue sessions, through working with experts in the field, networking opportunities, and through that also encouraging engagement in community, whatever their field of interest is. One of the examples is that in some of the work placements or internship placements we do here, those same organizations also have presence in South Africa. One of the examples this year is John Snow Incorporated.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They have, we have students placed there. They actually have a very big operation all over Africa, including in South Africa. So the students have automatic entry into the world there with John Snow Incorporated or similar other organizations that are active here, but also have presence in Africa and South Africa. So they have opportunities to engage.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll take a moment to call the panel up. Jennifer, I saw Gwen here. I do not know Colin.
Downstairs, so
Oh, downstairs, okay. Well, we have 7 minutes before the panel's supposed to start, so get him up here. Hi, Jennifer. As you can see, we very much abide by African traditions. We remain very flexible, very flexible. Never know what's going to happen next.
Were we going to start at 3? Was that?
Mm-hmm.
I thought we were going to start at
3,
3.
yeah. But we just had someone not show up, so. As we're waiting for the panel to assemble, Mr. Coleman's coming from upstairs. I might just add another word or two because I mentioned how long ago I was working in South Africa. Now I'm married to a South African, so I come and go to South Africa quite frequently, and have remained involved in a professional way too in the years since. But back then I was working I was at that point in time the young embassy officer who was covering student affairs and black politics and things like this in the apartheid era. And so I got to know the students of NUSIS and the Black People's Association and people like Steve Biko and many others, working with the student representative councils, which were in the townships, of course, and were in Soweto 76, of course, some of the movers behind those protests that result in such tragedy and all. So I've seen what a generation of youth can do in terms of making a huge impact and a marked difference in changing the way the world works. So you've got, I know you're the born free generation, as you guys call yourselves, and all these things are ancient history to a certain extent, but there really was a dynamism from people of your age at that time that made all the changes. I mean, from 76 onwards, of course, began the dramatic changes that began to make the apartheid government understand that things could not go on with status quo, that they would have to change, and that all people would have to realize their destinies. So it's quite a history for you guys to inherit. Well, let's see. We're still a moment ahead of the panel time, and Mr. Coleman's not here yet. I understand First Secretary Mosise is here from the embassy. Is he in the room? Oh, well, we were just about to start the panel, but we have a few moments if you'd like to come up and make your greetings. This is Alu Masisi from the South African Embassy, First Secretary, who's just welcomed you on behalf of Ambassador Rasool.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for being patient with me, running a little bit late. I don't know whether that's a good thing or bad thing. Probably if my boss was here, I don't know what would happen. Now that he's not here, I hope you're not going to tell him what happened, and that might impact my next review, you know. Well, thank you for the invitation. I know that you had invited Ambassador Rasool, and as you can see, I'm not yet an ambassador. But he could not be here due to other commitments, but he should be here sometime later on in the day. But I hope you'll be satisfied with the second choice on the menu today, and that's me. Firstly, I'd like to welcome the SAWIP students to the United States of America, and I believe this is a great opportunity that you have been given. SAWIP is really a great opportunity because, in my view, you know, monopolies are something that perhaps only exists in the corporate world. You know, you can have a lot of monopolies. However, as far as human beings are concerned, you know, nobody really has monopoly over knowledge. You can never really have monopoly over wisdom or even a sense of humor. As you can see, I'm a very funny guy. Anyway, but I don't have all the humor in the world. Therefore, human interactions are intrinsic to our quest to becoming, you know, enlightened, wiser, and even better human beings. As such, you, the SAWIP students, have been afforded an opportunity to interact with others in this great country, so you can become better at serving in your communities and be at the heart of South Africa's transformation. As we all know, the month of June has great significance in South Africa. It's a month where we normally reflect on the heroism of the class of 1976. And their struggle was for better education. They were born into South Africa where your self-actualization depended on the color of your skin and not on the insight you had. It was an environment that condemned the majority of Africans to eternal poverty. let me also note, opportunities for a good education were also limited by the color of your skin, with Bantu education being sort of like the order of the day for the majority of the people. This is not the case anymore in South Africa. And to show that this is not the case anymore, some of you are even born frees, as we call you in South Africa. And therefore, I'd like to challenge you. You know, the class of 1976, they have delivered on their task of a non-discriminatory education system. We might still have to deal with some of the challenges of the past, but now in 2014, exactly 20 years after the end of apartheid, South Africa is definitely really faced with new challenges that require you to face them. These are challenges of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. It is, in my view, that the current challenges are to a large extent not requiring a lot of political advocacy, labor advocacy, and maybe even social advocacy. They require young people who are thinkers, and most importantly, doers. South Africa is in need of young people who start corporations and employ others. If you don't, who will, by the way? You are the educated, smart, and capable people. But it's time to go beyond the intellectualization of the problem and get down to doing the work. And in South Africa, everybody has, you know, a solution to all the problems we have. But we seem to have very few people who actually get down to doing what needs to be done. So, and necessarily, unemployment cannot necessarily be resolved by rallies. You know, in 1976, it was okay, you can go on a rally and say, we are taking mass action against this apartheid government. But right now, that can be only resolved by venture creation, innovation that broadens the pie in the economy. But the next Facebook or Twitter of sort should actually hail from South Africa. I don't see why we can't have that. Some people often say, you know, people who work with a hammer normally, you know, if you're used to working with a hammer and we bring you a new problem, for the most part, you'll take out a hammer and you'll try to fix it. Sometimes that works, but sometimes you'll break whatever you are trying to fix. In 1976, well, striking was the right hammer that we could use to break the mighty apartheid state. But right now, the current South African economy requires much of a softer touch, you know, something like somebody who knows how to use a screwdriver. You know, a nice touch, not banging everything, you know. And therefore, it is an era that is really calling for more of innovation, creativity, and grabbing the opportunity, because opportunities are there. In 1976, there was no opportunity. Right now, opportunities are created, but nobody can really force you to grab an opportunity. You just have to recognize a moment. If you don't grab the moment will pass you by. It's really as simple as that. And, you know, while the youth of the past are gathered for mass action, I think the new South Africa must create centers of excellence, business incubators, business plans to an extent. I think gone are the days where you only have a resume or a CV. You should also have a business plan handy. And it's time really where we need to apply and test some of the startup models of entrepreneurship and drive employment opportunities. And maybe tell you what, Nelson Mandela stood for the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony with equal opportunities. That ideal in the past 20 years yielded the good story that South Africa can now tell. In the past 20 years, South Africa managed to grow the GDP from around about 136 billion US dollars to over 400 billion US dollars. The value of listed companies on the JSE grew from just over 100 billion dollars to well over 800 billion US dollars. We built, over 1,500 new health facilities in that period. New classrooms, we added, 3.5 million houses for the poor. Millions of students actually are able to study now in South Africa because of government funding that is easily available. And therefore, with the current effort, or with the current SAWIP call, and the alumni included, I'm sure South Africa can and will reach new highs and beyond what we've actually been able to do in the past 20 years. So in the next few weeks, my challenge to you is, as you interact with other people, be open to opportunities and network and learn from others. And most importantly, it is my hope that you realize that it is not ordinary people who do extraordinary things. It is actually ordinary people who do extraordinary things, and then they earn the right to being called extraordinary. In conclusion, I would like to thank the SAWIP board and their sponsors, the host families, and people like Jaya and others who actually get this program running. You are real leaders who are building South Africa one student at a time. And who knows, the next Nelson Mandela might be in this room. All the best to all of you in the next coming weeks. Thanks.
Thank you, Alu. It was worth the wait. Okay, we'll get started now. We have a panel of individuals here who bridge the 20 years we're talking about, 1994 to the present day, who have looked deeply at South Africa and the situation there. I'm not going to speak anymore because we're going to be running short on time, and we want to be sure to leave some time for interaction with you guys for questions. So our first speaker is going to be Colin Coleman, who's just arrived. Welcome, Colin. Steve McDonald. Good to meet you. He's the managing director, I think it is, the title of, and partner on Goldman Sachs South and Sub-Saharan Africa. You've got their bios before you, so I won't elaborate on the bios. After Colin speaks, I will ask Jennifer Cook, who directs the Africa program at CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies, here in Washington, D.C., former staffer on the Hill and other things, and she's spent a lot of time in South Africa, and we'll bring her wisdom to the table. And then we'll ask Gwen Michael, who also has spent a lot of time in South Africa. She's professor of anthropology and foreign service at Georgetown University, where she's been for a number of years in different roles, and that's all elaborated in your bios. So we've tried to make the presentations divided into logical sequences so we don't cover the same ground. With Colin, of course, we'll be looking more at the economic situation and issues around that. So Colin, would you start?
How long do I have?
Yes.
How long?
About 12 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, fantastic to be here. I see some friends in the audience. And great to be back in Washington. Very hot. It's a little cooler in South Africa. I'm not sure if that's symbolic, but interesting times. Not as interesting as in Iraq or Ukraine or other parts of the world, but certainly for us on the journey of South Africa. And I'm a native South African. Was very involved in the transition in South Africa. Was in the anti-apartheid movement, went into the constitutional negotiations from the period 89 to 94, and then went into banking for the last 20 years, and currently at Goldman. I was in Kenya last week. The week before that I was in Nigeria. The week before that I was in Gabon. So I'm sort of traveling the continent, and I think getting a feeling as to South Africa and its place in Africa and Africa's place in the world, and it's a very interesting time. What can I say? I think, let me just ask the audience, how many of you are aware of the 2 Decades of Freedom report or have read it of Goldman Sachs? So that's roughly 1/3 of the audience. I would just point out to you that on the Goldman Sachs website, if you just Google Colin Coleman, Goldman Sachs, it'll link you to the report, which is called 2 Decades of Freedom. And that report was undertaken because the nature of the narrative around South Africa had become quite skewed, in negative sense, quite emotional, and not very much based in fact about what we'd achieved in the last 20 years since Nelson Mandela took office. And so we looked at 3 things. One is, what are the structural advances that have taken place? 2, what are the challenges that remain? And then the ever-present question, what is to be done? And so we went through that. And there is an updated report that was loaded on 27th April 2014 to celebrate the 2 decades. So if you saw it before, go and have a look at that one, because that's loaded very up-to-date information. And I'll give you a very short summary, but I think it's also important to talk about what's happened in the election and in the post-election environment and where things are headed. So for the detail, go to the report. It's 70 pages. It'll take you an hour maximum to read through. There's speaker notes that talk through the slides, so you don't need to hear my boring voice. Essentially, the structural advances that have taken place between 94 and 2014 have been very, very significant. South Africa was basically a broken economy in 1994. Why do I say that? We had a negative reserve balance sheet of negative $3 billion, which was net of a mark-to-market on open FX net open forward position of the South African Reserve Bank. So for Nelson Mandela, his first presidential day was with zero in the coffers. He had a very divided country. Obviously had gone through the rainbow election, but I personally was involved in what was effectively a last-minute deal to bring all parties into the election, and I can tell you that we were hours away from a conflagration that would have killed 1 million people in South Africa. And through negotiating the last-minute accord to bring in Carter into the election, we managed to avoid that. And we obviously had a peaceful election. But peaceful in the context of 40,000 people having died in the previous 20 years. And so Nelson Mandela had a broken economy. He had a very divided political environment, and he brought about a period of reconciliation and nation building, which was essential. And they brought into their economics team people like Tito Mboweni, Trevor Manuel, a bunch of other people who drove effectively an austerity program to get the fiscal ratios back in check. And what we saw then was basically 3.3% annual compound growth rate in the next 20 years, inflation coming down from 14% in the 14 years prior 1994 to 6% in the next 20 years. So falling inflation, higher growth rates. They introduced effectively a social welfare policy which took from 2 million people to 16 million people currently social welfare grants for the poor. And so some people would say that this latest election in which the ANC won 62% was effectively the social welfare grant recipients, who the poor, 16 million of them, plus the civil service, who's 2 million people, plus the rising middle class, another 10 million people, rewarding the ANC for their investment in those people. And therefore, the black middle class, the whites, the colors, and the Indians who are not voting for the ANC are effectively a nice to have but a not necessary condition for the ANC to win elections. And so effectively we had this rising expenditure on the poor. We had a rise in the middle class as the African lower income groups rose in terms of their purchase power, in terms of their role in society. And as I say, in the report shows you that between the year 2000 and 2010, 10 million Africans entered into the middle classes out of a population of 52 million. So it's a very large rising tide. And we had a period from 2000 to 2007 leading to the global financial crisis of a golden period of growth and low inflation, if you put it that way. Now, so I'll cut away from the structural advances to the challenges. What we didn't manage to do was to effectively break the structural problem of unemployment. So in South Africa, we have 15 million people working today, 7.5 million people not, made up of 4.6 million who are actively looking for work, and the balance who have given up looking for work. And that gives us an unemployment ratio on a broad basis of 36%. 36% must be one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. And we have a Gini coefficient of over 60, making us the recorded developing market with the highest inequality. So unemployment inequality remains the largest problem in South Africa. And effectively what you're seeing with the rising protests around social service delivery is an inadequate pace of dealing with this inequality problem. Although infrastructure delivery, social welfare has improved the lives of South Africans poor significantly, it has not been significant enough a movement to start dealing with that structural problem. And unfortunately, the inequality remains racially defined. 85% of blacks are largely poor, 85% of whites are largely wealthy. So that now leads us, if you like, to the next phase. And this is what President Zuma called the next phase of South Africa's transition and the need for radical, so-called radical socioeconomic policies of transformation. No one has been able to define what that radical socioeconomic transformation is. I would just say it's a next phase of accelerating economic reform, but it doesn't sound very popular. But that's what it is. It means effectively now liberating the economy. How do we liberate the economy? In a number of ways. But if you would read, I wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times just before the elections and called it South Africa's chance for the second Nelson Mandela miracle. It basically talks about a two-speed society. So we have this one-speed society, that's this very sophisticated, urban, non-racial, truly mobile South Africa. And then we have this other, that's this peri-urban or rural, poor, young, very marginalized, increasingly hopeless and angry group. And this two-speed society cannot sustain. We have to have a merging of the two societies, but it needs different strategies. So the one strategy needs further fiscal stimulus to the poor, to lift them up, and there are various strategies for that. And the other is to effectively sophisticate and liberate the market economy to be more efficient and effective. So in closing, I'll just say, if you look at the budget from 94 to today, we've effectively grown the dollarized, so net of FX movements, we've grown the economy and the budget 4 times, which is a remarkable rise on a dollar basis in 20 years. The social welfare net, or the people investment portion, has become 60% of the budget, from a budget that on inheritance Nelson Mandela had 28% being spent on defense and debt service. Now 64% is spent on people investment. But that quality of spend is very poor. So if you look at the education, the health system, if you look at the state-owned enterprises, they are highly inefficient. And so we absolutely have to have better governance, better efficient resource expenditure, and that means we need an economy that is more like China than it is like South Africa as we currently know it. And I say China because when I speak to the top members of the African National Congress, which I have had the good fortune to do, I say to them, I don't understand why South Africa feels that they need to be more ideological than the Chinese Communist Party, and that state capitalism would get us further if they were to invest in the developmental state through being efficient, through being market orientated, and effectively getting a productive culture going in the state rather than a consumptive culture. Consumptive meaning paying people to be in jobs but not effectively evaluating the performance, rather than actually being productive and creating ongoing sustainable investment from this resource. So these two dynamics of invest in amongst the poor and really accelerate and reform the economy is sort of my own take on it. You've probably seen the state of the nation. I think the two worries going forward are the youth factor, and obviously the Economic Freedom Front of Julius Malema is trying to play on that youth factor. I'm relatively dismissive right now of that being a long-term threat, but the youth factor is a major issue, and they are 70% of this group that is unemployed that I mentioned earlier are under the age of 34, and they're unskilled. So that's a threat. And of course, you know, I participated in President Mbeki's scenario planning, and there was something called the Skadonk scenario. The Skadonk scenario is the taxi that ultimately loses the undercarriage, the suspension, the engine starts to wobble, and the tires have flats, and it's a skodonk that skodonks around. And that is a threat. So it's not a massive Big Bang problem. It's a things fall apart problem. Now, the best thing about South Africa is that we have great managers, sophisticated financial institutions, and we have a tremendous backdrop in the neighborhood. So we have lots going for us. There's no reason to believe that we're going to end up skodonk. But there's some people that believe the leadership is not leading South Africa fast and furious enough. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Colin. And you hit it right on the nail, 12 minutes, so you're very efficient yourself. And set a good example for our two other speakers. Jennifer?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Steve. And actually, thanks for hosting this afternoon with SAWIP. I think we really don't get enough open discussion and debates around South Africa here in town, and the Woodrow Wilson Center really has been a center of that. And reading from afar the headlines coming out of South Africa, you get a very gloomy picture. And I think heading into these elections, and I've been asked to say a few words about the elections. Whether the ANC, the betrayal of the ANC, and the vision of its founders and so forth. So thanks for doing this. I've been asked to say a bit about the elections and then maybe a bit about the U.S. policy towards Africa and how that has evolved over time. And I've said I'm a bit daunted by lecturing to a room full of South Africans about what's going on in their country, but this is from our perspective. As I said, there's a lot of Sturm and Drang in the run-up to these elections, and the headlines that capture the attention here in Washington are the big scandals, Nkandla-gate, Gupta-gate, and so forth. Things very much centered around the person of the president. Within the ANC, this sense of kind of fracturing, the defections and infighting and horse trading. Obviously, a youth league, which is presumably the crucible for training new upcoming ANC leaders, not particularly promising and very polarizing and a bit wacky at times. The announcement before the elections by NUMSA that they would not be supporting the ANC, the National Union of Mining Workers of South Africa, one of the largest of the COSATU members. And then even some of the stalwarts within the party, I mean, the Ronnie Casrills and others from the South African Communist Party saying, this has become a party of cronyism, they're feathering their nest. And so a lot of disillusionment on the ANC, and the question of where does it go from here? Will it hold together? And how well will it perform in these elections? On top of that, you've had kind of an expanding, at least from here, you see more and more protests around service delivery in urban settings. You had the textbook scandal in the midst of an education system that is gravely dysfunctional and really is probably one of the missing elements from the transformation I think that you were talking about in some ways. A health system that is doing better, but that needs massive infusions of resources if it's going to reach the health needs of South African people. And then on the economy, you still do have these fundamental structural issues, particularly in sectors like the mining sector, and obviously Marikana and its aftermath raised big questions about the security sector, for one, leadership on the other, but also this dilemma of mine workers living in squalid, who are working in the bedrock of the South African economy, living in squalid conditions. Unions that maybe have become too comfortable or too cozy with a political and business elite, and a business and a government that was very slow to respond in an effective way on that. So you had the downgrade of the economy by Standard & Poor. You had Nigeria talking of insult to injury, surpassed South Africa as the largest economy, according to their figures, of course, as the largest economy in Africa. So there's kind of a, oh my gosh, what is happening in South Africa? Is it getting left behind in this whole big Africa Rising excitement that goes around Washington? And much of this is laid at the ANC's door. So going into these, I think there was a question about how well they would do. In the end, they did quite well. They were a comfortable, large majority. They lost a couple of points, but percentage points, but retained this significant majority. I think there's, in the South African press, there's a question, was this the last election where people really voted on loyalty and allegiance? But I think lost in that is the fact of what the ANC has delivered over the last 20 years, what has been the actual transformation in people's lives. And this is particularly true, they did quite well in the rural areas where the social grant programs are particularly focused. And so to dismiss it as kind of simply out of loyalty or affection for the ANC, I think is a bit cynical, and doesn't recognize the massive gains that have been made despite all these critical headlines over time. What was also interesting in the elections were obviously gains by the Democratic Alliance. It gained a couple of percentage points in every state, but particularly in Gauteng and dense urban populations. It really kind of locked its grip in Western Cape. And I think showed that it is a party that is here to stay, unlikely anytime soon to topple, but to topple the ANC, perhaps on municipal or elections coming up in 2016. It may make some more gains, but it does provide a basis for, I think, future kind of coalitions of potential defectors from the ANC going forward. And then the economic freedom fighters, in just 8 months, mobilizing over 1 million voters, gaining seats in the National Assembly, and becoming the main opposition in Limpopo and Northwest Province, which tells us something. And we all may dismiss Malema as a bit of a demagogue and a clown. I think of him as kind of the Sarah Palin of South Africa. But he represents something that's very real. And I think that shouldn't be taken lightly, and probably opens the space and the possibility there of more left-leaning parties really representing the vision of the interests of the poor, the workers, and so forth, but in a serious way. And I think that's what's lacking right now in the political discourse. So it's not as though the ANC is going to collapse, but you do have the basis for significant challengers, all of which is to the good of South Africa in the long run. ANC, as I said, unlikely to collapse soon, and it is showing the kind of the problems inherent in a de facto one-party state. The horse trading that goes on, it means that excellence doesn't always rise to the top in ministries and in civil service positions. You have negotiations that happen within the party and made less explicit, give less explicit choices to voters and some and so forth. You sometimes have confusing messaging from an outsider point of view on what is the policy going on. And this is particularly true in foreign policy, I have to say, as we look at U.S.-South Africa relations. And then sometimes good plans, but stalling on implementation, whether because of turf battles or internal disagreements and so forth. I think going forward, Zuma's speech has laid out, this focus on economic growth, but at the same time investing in people. As you've said, it's a tricky balance to strike, because how do you sustain the one over time? Will that social investment be sustainable when you're working with a shrinking tax base in a way over time? And so how do you do both at once? And that negotiation is probably why the ANC will stay where it is for a good while to come, since I think neither the challenge from the right or the challenge for the left has the full answer to that. And it's going to be kind of a messy negotiation of how you balance that in the middle. I don't know how I am for time.
You got about 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, just to say that I think the ANC, in that way, South Africa is becoming kind of a normal, messy democracy, and that's all a good thing. And these debates are happening. I'd say also for the U.S.-South Africa relationship, it's becoming a more normal relationship. I think we went through an initial honeymoon phase in the Clinton era, after the transition, very uncritical. I would say we went to a nadir under the Bush years with mutual eye-poking, whether it was on Iraq, Afghanistan, Article 98, or on my side on HIV/AIDS and on policy towards Zimbabwe. I think things have evened out somewhat, but it's not going to return to the time of the late 90s, I think. Now I think some of there are big discussions going on trade and trade agreements and preferences for the U.S. Is the U.S. getting cut out of some of these trade agreements? I think it's really interesting and possibly useful that the U.S. ambassador comes out of the union movement here in the United States, and I think that sends a strong signal. I'd say for all the eye-poking that we've done mutual, and it's on both sides over the years, the relationship is a very strong one. I think there's a lot of affinity and affection within non-governmental, educational, and people-to-people relationships. The U.S. has put significant investments in HIV, close to $5 billion in the last 8-9 years, and has every interest in seeing this economy grow and some of these structural issues being overcome. I'll leave it at that so we can open up for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. The discipline rolls. Okay, Gwen.
Well, I'm going to try to do the 12 minutes, too. Try hard. I think it's wonderful to see the SAWIP group here. I saw the class last year, and to see you today is really wonderful. It's really inspiring to see what this room looks like. It bodes well for South Africa. So I'll just start there. I think, this is a wonderful opportunity to assess the last 20 years. I won't try to go toward the economic or toward the political because my colleagues have done that. But as a social scientist, I want to emphasize the importance of looking back as you look forward. And as an American talking about South Africa, I want to emphasize how much we have looked at comparatively our country and your country over the last few years. So my comments are kind of framed in that way. I want to make a few reflections then on what I see as some of the progress and some of the challenges going forward. So my first reflection is on something that you all have talked about already, Colin especially, on education, the whole push to diversify and open up education for blacks and other minorities in South Africa, and to diversify in business, and the challenges that are still being posed there. I understand that from the perspective of having been one of those people who went into college right after the civil rights legislation in the United States, and it made a major impact on educational institutions and on careers, and that's happening for South Africa. But as a researcher, I went into the Center for Social and Development Studies at the University of Natal in '92, and this was a really interesting time, an opportunity for me to assess what was going on within the universities and for them to be shocked at my blackness and shocked at the fact that I was a woman. And you could see some of the challenges that South African educational institutions, higher educational institutions, were going to have to take on, and they have been taking on. But there was a lot of fear about the admission of people like me and other black South Africans into the academy. What would it mean, and what kinds of theories and proposals and plans of action would they be pushing forward? here we are, 10 years on. The Black Economic Empowerment Law of 2003 had a dramatic impact also for business. And African businesses have done a lot to open up and to diversify. The question is whether it's fronting so that they can meet the letter of the law and appeal to a wider variety. Is it fronting without substance? And that's a real challenge moving forward. Many people in South Africa are realizing that opening up through affirmative action is in business or in education is good. But the question is, how do you match that, and Colin spoke to this just briefly, how do you match that with other social policies that are really going to deepen it and that are going to push opportunity, access to economic growth into these communities, and that are going to encourage entrepreneurship from the bottom up? That's really going to be important for combating some of the poverty that we talked about. This whole argument over affirmative action, as you know, is still going on. In democracies, this tends to happen. So I think sometimes it goes in cycles, and it's going in again here in the United States, and it will continue to go in South Africa. But I think that the whole fear of this integration is misplaced. If we look carefully, we'll see that even when blacks are going to some of the most competitive high schools in South Africa, they're still testing out at a few points below what whites are testing out, which means they're still entering. So there is a penalty that is being paid for all those years of lack of access. Blacks are paying a penalty. And it's going to take a period moving forward in which you continue to do a lot of things to make sure that access deepens. My second reflection is on issues of violence and the need for restorative justice. When I got to South Africa, I picked up the Indicator and, of course, the journal that comes out of Natal there. And, of course, one of the big issues was what to do about the violence. And I could see it up close and personal because as ANC and Inkatha were battling each other, the bullets were whizzing over my head. I understood that South Africans were going to have to work out some way in which they could sit down with each other and work out a strategy for dealing with this. And they did do that. And you managed to draw together the National Party and Inkatha, and it's been productive. And yet, the violence is still persisting. It's a different kind of violence, but the violence is still there. And the question is, why should it persist when a democracy is strengthening? I'm an American. It's persisting in the United States, even as our democracy wobbles but hopefully strengthens. And some of the answers have to do with anger that is still beneath the surface. In the report that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they talked about youth and violence and a report on how do we deal with the youth. But one of the things that still hasn't been done is to address that group of youth who are now adults. They were youths who were freedom fighters, who were not classified as freedom fighters, and who were never offered the kinds of opportunities for access that a freedom fighter, you bring back your fighters in and you somehow integrate them. Well, these young people were never integrated. And so one of the major challenges, as we can celebrate what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did and what it revealed about the anger that is still there, but I think some of that anger is still being reflected in violence. Violence toward whom? Well, violence toward women. We're seeing a lot of this. I was reading one or two articles, and they were talking about women. They were talking about South Africa being the most violent country in the world toward women. And we have to say, my goodness, this is ironic. So women go from being a part of that female fighter group to being, 40-something% of the parliamentarians to being the predominant victims of violence? What's going on here? And it is an issue that demands that we look closer. You don't have, a hedge on all of this. It's happening in the United States too, but it's happening with, it's worse in South Africa, so that you begin to see that there may be a question of women's political visibility. If you've got 42%, are those who are left out, or are those who feel that women's rise has been at their expense, meaning elders and traditional leaders and men in communities? And is there a job that needs to be done? I say that because there's a job that needs to be done here in the United States too. But there is a job that needs to be done in South Africa. And it may be time for women and non-governmental organizations to come together to have a dialogue about how it is you address some of those persisting feelings of anger and at marginalization that may translate into the violence against women that we are seeing. I'm challenged. How many minutes do I have?
You have, I'll give you 3. Give you 3.
I'll continue on that women's thing for just a moment longer, and no, I'll leave it. The reflection, another reflection. It's on racial and gender equity and how important those have been in South Africa and how important they continue to be, because they tend to push the society toward justice. And especially when you are strengthening a democracy, it means that you're now poised to be able to see other injustices. And so here South Africa has taken a lead, because you've been a model for us on how the Constitution needed to integrate lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. All of that has been a positive insight into the ways in which the Constitution can push that movement forward. So that has been a real positive. And yet, you're also getting the throwbacks. And to some extent, this merges with some of the things I said before, because that opposition to this opening up of space for new groups also means that those who are still angry lash out. And so you get the gangs who are going to, teach a lesbian how to be a woman again. Or so that kind of violence can continue to rear its head. And a democracy is always working toward subjugating that, dealing with it, finding ways to bring people together to discuss it. But my final observation is that it has made, I'll leave aside AIDS, we all know that. You've done wonderful work on AIDS, and although it persists, the challenge is still there, but you're moving in the right direction on that. Although the violence against women and against gays presents a problem for that trend of lessening prevalence in HIV/AIDS that we've seen. And my final observation is that this is just fantastic. Democracies wobble, and you're wobbling on in just a wonderful direction. What I want to see over the next few years is that some of you in this audience are going to be trying to find ways to address some of that residual anger, to address some of that residual violence, to address some of that need for continuing openness. And I have every confidence that you're going to be doing it. So,
okay, thank you very much. Very good note to end on. We're left with about 15 minutes for question and answer before we have to take our break. The way I'm going to handle this is, I think, not have our panelists respond immediately, but take about 4 to 5 questions from the audience. I'll recognize you when you raise your hand. Wait for a microphone, then please identify yourself and your association. We'll take all the questions at once. We'll write them down and then let the panelists sort of answer the questions as they can, as they're directed to each individual or the whole panel, and make any final observations they want to make. And I think that's probably all we'll have time for. So the first hand I see, Matthew, is right there beside you. Second hand I've seen is this woman right here. The third hand I'd seen is the woman back there, and the woman in the middle, and the other woman right there. So, and we'll get to you too. So that's it. Don't anybody else raise their hand. Okay, thank you. Ed.
Ed Barber. I was intrigued by Professor Michaels raising the issue of gays, treatment of gays, because we had worked in recent years with an African government where treatment of gays was an issue.
Yes.
And we've all read about Uganda and others. Now, some of that hostility, I believe, is a function of fundamentalist religious groups, whether Christian or Muslim or others. But those are imports.
Right.
And I was wondering to what extent hostility to gays is a function of traditional African culture. Is it built in somehow, or is that an import as well?
Yes, hi. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. A question mostly to Jennifer about the future role of South Africa vis-a-vis Zimbabwe, and also in terms of the Muslim population in South Africa. What role can they play positively with regard to some of the developments, particularly that we're seeing now in Nigeria?
Okay. To the young man in front of you, we won't take them in the order they were raised. I won't forget you. I won't forget you. Okay, yes.
Joshua Knott, a young leader of the SARV 2014 group. I'm working with the CSIS, so I'm not going to have a conflict of interest, so I'm not going to ask Jennifer anything. My question is directed to Mr. Coleman. Understanding that with neoliberal economic policies brought with it an increase in GDP, it also brought with it vast inequalities. And one of the reasons for the removal of Mr. Mbeki were his economic policies. Where does South Africa sit now with the developmental state model and Dr. Davies' increased investment in infrastructure?
Very good. Okay, yeah, the young lady at the back there, Jude, you see who I'm talking about? Yeah, raise your hand there. All the way at the back, yeah, in the red and black, yeah.
Hi, Annalisa Bala. I'm a SAWA post and work at the IMF. This question is primarily directed at Colin. I wanted you to elaborate on what you mean by improving the quality and efficiency of public spending. And I'm hoping you'll focus your comments particularly on education and health outcomes, because as a percentage of GDP, South Africa spends an exorbitant amount. In fact, it far exceeds most advanced countries, in fact, most developing countries, on education. But the outcomes have been nothing short of atrocious. And there is perhaps something to be said about the influence of trade unions and the fact that a lot of our teachers just aren't in classrooms. But beyond that, can you give anything a little bit more specific? Because there's a lot that's outlined, for instance, in the National Development Plan on enforcing measures of accountability and so on, but there's a lot of resistance to that. So given the strong labor union movement in South Africa, what are some very pragmatic solutions for improving quality of spending?
Okay, let's be disciplined on our questions too. Okay, the lady there in the middle, and then we'll come to you.
Yes, my name is Brenda Wilson, and I'm a media consultant who has worked for a considerable amount of time in South Africa as well. And my question is in some ways related to her question as well, because there is some mention of corruption and cronyism, and that seems in some respect tied to, I suppose, a lack of training and something which does not filter down to the provincial level, so that whatever the intent may be, there don't seem to be enough people, in fact, to either perform at the provincial government level or even in the schools to actually do those things. What will it take, I suppose, to really address that? It's a combination of political resistance, because these positions are used as political payouts often. So the question is, how are you going to, do you have people in the pipeline who can fill these positions? What's the capacity to address it when it's so tied up with political payback and cronyism?
Okay, very good question. Thank you. And Lori.
Good afternoon. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflicts and violence prevention here. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. I'm from Africa. I'm from Kenya. I wanted to comment on Professor Gwendolyn. Violence against women is all over. Even here in the United States, it's worse than even in Africa. What I want to say is we are working with South African young people in arts and culture who are playing games and doing a lot of arts on violence against women. In fact, they'll be here maybe in September. I work with them. And we are planning to see the president. So seeing the president of South Africa, we will be doing dialogue with the president and the young people against and violence, why there is violence. So when we have young people like these ones here and in South Africa, they are the leaders of tomorrow. So if they know how bad violence is, and then with that dialogue with the president, I think we can reduce most of violence from women, and it will not only be South Africa, it will be all over Africa. So violence against women and humanity is all over. So I think with the young leaders here, you need more voice on violence against women, so that when you grow men, don't beat your women. And the women are also violent. They beat men too. So it's a gender-based violence. So thank you so much for that.
Okay. Thank you, Rosemary.
So how do we prevent that? They are here now.
Yeah, I put that big how and question mark. Okay, I think we'll let that end the questions. We have about 9 minutes to wrap it all up. We'll start in reverse order. Gwen, there were a couple of questions specifically to you, but you can speak to any or all of them. Yeah.
Okay, let me start at the last one and then go backward. I am really glad you raised this question. With the presidential summit that's going to be here in August, all the presidents are going to be here. And yet there is YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, that they're going to be here. Those leaders, youth leaders, are going to be here. One of the questions that I've been asking as we've been having conversations about this is, to what extent are these two or representatives of these two groups going to have a chance to meet, so that these questions can be actually put to the leaders? One of the things I said was that, are we going to let them come and bear no penalty for the things they've overlooked back home? What can we do that will make it possible for the young leaders and for the SAWIP? How long are you all here, SAWIP?
17.
Until September?
No,
July, you're gone. Okay. Well, then you have to talk to the young leaders. You have to make sure that they get these issues before the president. And they said, well, we hope that what we'll do is to sum up and to bring that in to each day's session or each panel session. But I think it would be wonderful to have some of the YALI leaders do the sum up and bring those issues into the presidents so that there's a direct discussion. The second thing had to do with improving the quality of education. And I'm going backwards. Lots of money spent, but fewer results. And how do you improve that? Or quality of results. I think that that's an issue we've been grappling with, obviously, here in the United States. One of the solutions we tried to come up with was our charter school movement. And that was to provide an opportunity so that teachers, people who have this training, can do it in a different environment and can open up the possibilities. Now, I'm not a fan of the charter movement because I think it has deprived our public schools of a lot of energy and opportunity. But in a place like South Africa, it may be possible for the government to devise strategies whereby another category of schools are created that begin to provide adult education, education for people within a community context, so that you're actually building also from the bottom up. And I don't know what this is going to do for the teachers, for the unions. I don't know what kinds of responses you're going to get. But I think we need to be looking for creative ways to use the teachers that you have, but use them more effectively, which means push them into rural areas, push them into adult education, push them into support for job training in ways that help lower poverty and decrease anger. This last one, which was the first question raised, had to do with traditional culture and gays. No, because the stereotype is that that there were no gays and lesbians in traditional African cultures. Wrong. It's just that, and I'm going to be the anthropologist here, and I'm going to put on my Margaret Mead cap. Margaret Mead was one of my teachers. And I'm going to say that African societies, like many non-Western societies, figured out how they were going to use the capacities of all of their people. And that meant people who were gay and lesbian, and how do you provide them with opportunities that allow them to make a contribution to your society? And Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead said one more thing. To the extent that you deprive certain segments of your society from the opportunity to make that contribution, you deprive your society of development and growth. And so African societies understood that. They did it in a number of different ways. There were traditional rituals, there were marriages, you had male-to-male partnership and marriage in some cases. These are not widely known. And one of the impact of the colonial period with Christianity was to lower the visibility and the conversation about those kinds of things. So I do think that we're looking at, yes, the impact of the religious right. We're also looking at the dramatic Christianization that has occurred and the picking up of the Western anger and rejection against homosexuality. And that has pernicious results in places, not just Uganda, but in places like Uganda and Kenya and many other places. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gwen. Okay, Jennifer, the Zimbabwe and Muslim role questions?
Yeah, I think the United States has kind of given up on South Africa vis-a-vis Zimbabwe. I mean, one of the reasons maybe there have been so few South Africans coming through over the last decade in Washington is that anytime you get a South African in the room, what are you doing about Zimbabwe? As though it was South Africa's problem alone. And that, I think the U.S. expected too much of Zimbabwe in the first place, particularly of President Mbeki, who had a very different approach. And that became a very sore sticking point with the Bush administration and Colin Powell. Zimbabwe was kind of way up on the priority list of Africa talking points at that point. And I think Mbeki, kind of the quiet diplomacy approach, with kind of promises down the line of what might happen, bore no fruit. I think when President Zuma came to power, there was kind of a shift in strategy, and there was an opportunity for South Africa and SADC to get together, and it seemed like that was going to happen, and change the dynamic. So rather than have open-ended conversations with Mugabe and you need to reform this and let's hope it happens, it was we will not legitimate these elections unless you have met these conditions. And it had to do with security sector reform, with media freedoms, with international or regional observers being there for a long time. And then only then could Mugabe pass that goal. And that was a different strategy and a more practical one. Unfortunately, in the event, none of those conditions were met and the elections went through. And at this point, I would say that the U.S., Zimbabwe, it's like a thorn in the U.S. government side, but it's pretty low down on the agenda at this point. And EU has kind of shifted its stance on Zimbabwe, lifting some of the sanctions. The U.S. is not going to do that. It feels too locked into these, and there has to be some change before it lifts them. But I think it's feeling very stuck. It's kind of disillusioned with the opposition. It's disillusioned with ZANU-PF. Work through civil society, which kind of goes through anyway, and I don't think that South Africa, in the U.S. calculation, is anywhere in that right now, unless we move to a post-Mugabe scenario. Mm-hmm. On the Muslims, that's a difficult one for me to speak to. I'm not sure how organized, how coherent as a community. I mean, it seems that the Muslim community in South Africa is so very integrated that it doesn't really identify itself as such. But that's for some of the South Africans here to comment on. But there may be some things in terms of constitutional reforms in Nigeria. The problem is Nigerians are not going to want to listen to the South Africans for advice. There's kind of a rivalry there, so that's probably not going to happen. But maybe at a non-governmental level, in terms of reconciliation efforts, and South Africa has this incredible civil society and NGO environment that is very powerful. And we were talking earlier, has really changed things on a global scale. For example, on HIV treatment, legislation in South Africa opened up the world to that. So I'm not sure on that one. One thing on the public sector capacity, when I was there in 2010, looking at health issues, the hospitals were all on strike for a very long time, and egregious salaries there. At the same time, we're looking at South Africa to kind of expand its health capacity, and Maletsadi, the health minister, is really stuck once again in South Africa between these competing pressures for expanding capacity. But so much of health resources are taken up by the wage bill that very little room to maneuver. And that goes for, I would imagine, many sectors in South Africa.
Colin, you're left with the last word in no time. So you speak to the public spending, health quality and efficiency, and the how do you get qualified people in about.
Well, it's self-evident. I'm eating into your coffee break, so if you don't mind, I'll do that for a few minutes. But very good questions. Look, I think the bottom line is South Africa needs to grow faster as economic growth. We need 5% economic growth over the next 20 years to be $1 trillion economy and to start to eat into unemployment and inequality. And that's the overarching imperative in order to address this two-speed society. But it's not enough. What we need is better management of the resources. So the colleague from the IMF who asked the question about quality of spend is spot on. And in the report, if you have a look, there's actually evidence presented of the emerging market amount of spend, which is on par or higher in education and health, and that the quality of spending in the same time has fallen. Net of HIV and AIDS, our life expectancy has continued at the same level, although we've doubled the spending at the same in the period. And so let me try and answer your questions in this way. The problem with the quality, how is the money being spent, is what I use this catch-all phrase of a consumptive spending pattern. It's really a matter, when you look at the trade unions now, the trade unions who are obviously in alliance with the ANC, formally in a political alliance, have moved from 7% of their total members, being 2 million, in COSATU's case, being public civil servants, to 40% of COSATU's membership being civil servants. In other words, the people who are now the biggest employers of the trade union with whom they're in alliance is the government. And so I've said to President Zuma in private briefing around the 2 decades and since, that the biggest single issue he personally can contribute towards South Africa is effectively delivering the trade union movement as a constructive partner for growth and development. And when you look at the specifics of what's happening in the school system, effectively the trade unions are almost acting like a mafia, because they self-appoint They are the people determining who is getting appointed to principal positions, the high-paying jobs, the administrators. They are resisting performance management. They're resisting various forms of managing those performances and churning. And if you look at the quality of the teachers are in many cases the problem, not the students, because the quality of the teachers' skills are not up to actually teaching high-quality education. So there has to be a churn in the educators in order to get a better education output. But the resistance of the system is we want these people to be paid salaries. Now, are they pitching for work? Are they sober? How many days are they teaching, etc.? So it comes down to management. It comes down to performance management. It comes down to making sure that there's much better systems. And that's a political process that the ANC needs to deliver on. Second, if that's not going to happen, then you need to think of technological ways of delivering an alternative system. So, for example, if you look at the 2 Decades Freedom Report, I talk about internet access being woeful in South Africa relative to South Korea, and therefore us needing to spend more money on research and development and technology and internet access, particularly into the schools and into the communities. So spending some money in the state to ensure that schools have internet access and computers blanketed and secure in the schools is a critical way of getting the real tools in the hands of the students who need those tools. So I could go on and on, but there's some very basic things that need to be done. And this is why in the report we keep on saying this is not about changing the policies to go from 3.3% average growth last 20 years to 5% next 20 years. It's about maintaining those policies but being great on execution, getting the basics right, getting the performance to improve. The same on local government. Somebody asked about what they call provincial government, but it's really local government. It's really about getting the local government system to work, and that's why Pravin Gordhan being taken away from the Ministry of Finance is not necessarily good for the Ministry of Finance, but it's very good for social service delivery because he's the guy who fixed SARS, the South African Revenue Service. He's probably the best person to try and fix the local government. Things like billing, just basic billing or basic systems of management of the local. So there's a lot of emphasis being put now into local government. And that brings me into the last question about developmental state from Greg Knott's brother. Son. There we go. Greg's a great friend. So the developmental state, you know, it's strange to hear a business person in Washington say, we welcome a developmental state. But I keep on saying to people in the ANC, business wishes nothing more than efficient developmental state. What we can afford least is an inefficient developmental state, because that's like dipping down double. You know, you're spending money to do less, and we don't have the money. So we keep on saying to the ANC, if you want to have a developmental state, fantastic, but be efficient and be ruthless. Do not mess up, because if you mess up, you're wasting resources. And your alternative is to become a market-orientated state, or you'll have a left alternative develop, and you'll have effectively a socialist set of policies which will, to some be a disaster and some be the utopia that they want. So what the ANC is effectively looking to achieve is an efficient developmental state, and we wish them well, and we better help them, right, if they want to help. There's just two, if I might say, last two things. One is on the Africa Rising, because you mentioned the Africa Rising story. Just to leave this with you, South Africa, Kenya in the East African coast, and Nigeria in the West African coast are really the capitals and the nodal points for the Africa Rising story. So South Africa we've talked about. You can see it's got tremendous promise, but also lots of challenges. By the way, much less challenges than when I was growing up. When I was growing up, South Africa was a brutalized society, and that's why you've got violence against women today, is because the post-traumatic stress in the society, and I have post-traumatic stress because I lived with stress for 20 years growing up in the anti-apartheid movement, and I know what it is. I almost have to have adrenaline in order to keep functioning, so that's why I work at Goldman Sachs. But that's the truth, is that it was a very violent society and we have post-traumatic stress. So South Africa has these issues, but a great amount of promise. Nigeria really fundamentally, for those who visit there, you should visit if you haven't, is really this unbelievable demographic growth combination, but increasingly has serious political problems. So you've got, this Boko Haram problem. You've also got the Niger Delta problem, which people don't actually talk about much. You've got the fact that the central bank governor was dismissed and replaced. You've got all of the generals that have been taken out by President Goodluck, and there are many people who think President Goodluck is the target of this problem in Nigeria, that they want him replaced in the next election next year. So there's a bunch of issues surrounding Nigeria which are very promising and also challenging. Kenya, where I was, has the same dynamic of a promising confluence of oil and gas discoveries: Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Mozambique. For the first time, lots of Indian investment. Everyone, General Electric has their African headquarters in Nairobi, so on and so forth. But this emergence of this tremendous polarized political violence, which looks like it is really a powder keg that could explode or be diffused. I'm hoping it'll be diffused, but I was more nervous visiting Kenya than I have ever been in my life anywhere. And I've been in some very hair-raising situations. So the Africa Rising story, we must dismiss the old narrative, which is Africa is just hopeless. But we must also dismiss this new narrative that Africa is a one-way bet, positive bet. We have to engage with all these places and help them be viable. So thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, wonderful panel. Thank you, Colin and Jennifer and Gwen. We only got 5 minutes for the break. Rush on out there and get your coffee. Tony Carroll will be brutal when getting his panel together.
Rising proponent.
What's important to do both?
It's got to be tempered with a little bit of reality check.